Thank you. Okay, I'll give it 1 more minute and I'll get started. Okay, so dear distinguished speakers, dear participants, good day. It is my pleasure to welcome you all today on behalf of the Asia Pacific Adaptation Network, APAN, for this webinar on understanding loss and damage in Asia and the Pacific, science, policy dimensions, and mechanisms to avert, minimize, and address impacts. I will be your host today, and my name is Ellen. I'm the APAN coordinator. APAN is an open knowledge platform for climate change adaptation and resilience in Asia Pacific. It was developed and launched by UNEP under the Global Adaptation Network in 2009. Before I hand over to our moderator, I will just briefly present the agenda of the session. So we will briefly have some opening remarks. Then we will have an interactive session via Zoom poll. Then we'll move on to presentations, and we'll have a presentation about the loss and damage science, and also a loss and damage presentation for under the UNFCCC. Then we'll have a panel discussion, and we will finish with a presentation on CSO perspectives. After that, we will have a Q&A, and I would like to invite you all to use the Q&A box, please, and ask all your questions. And then we will finish with a summary and closing. So our moderator today, please, the slide next. So our moderator today is Dr. Alvin Chandra. He is currently the Global Coordinator for Adaptation Policy and Partnerships, and joined UNEP in 2020 to coordinate UNEP's GCF portfolio at the time. Much of Alvin's work has focused on loss and damage, innovative finance, technology, and digital solutions in favor of joint adaptation and mitigation actions. He has served as lead author for the UNEP Global Environment Outlook 6, and also as expert reviewer of the IPCC special reports on ocean and cryosphere and climate change and land. Alvin, thank you, and the floor is yours. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Helen, for that warm introduction. Bula, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the webinar session on understanding of loss and damage in the Asia and Pacific region. In this webinar today, we will focus on the science and the policy dimensions and ways to avert, minimize, and address climate-induced loss and damage impacts from climate change. I am Alvin Chandra, and Global Coordinator for Adaptation Policy and Partnership at the UN Environment Programme, and it is my great honor today to moderate today's webinar. We know from our lived experiences in the region and also from science that human-induced climate change has already caused loss and damages in the Asia-Pacific region. We also know from the region that loss and damage is unequally distributed across the region and sectors. It is, my colleague and friends, already having an impact on the most vulnerable countries. To address loss and damage, we need to better understand what the financial, governance and institutional needs are. And in this regard, we have an interesting line of presenters, speakers, and panelists today to build and develop an understanding in this important area of work. So today's session will be structured with a mix of remarks, presentations, and panel discussions. And I would like to start with inviting Mr. Jerome Ilgan, who is the co-chair of the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. He is also the Chief Policy Research for the Policy Research Development Division at the Climate Change Commission in Philippines. Jerome leads the technical development of the Philippine National Adaptation Plan and is one of the champions of the expert group on non-economic losses and the expert group on slow onset events under the EXCOM at UNFCCC. Jerome, I would like to invite you for your opening remarks. Over to you.
Thank you, Alvin, for the warm introduction. Hello, everyone. Cheers from Manila. Distinguished panelists and participants, on behalf of the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this webinar on understanding loss and damage in Asia and the Pacific, science, policy dimensions, and mechanisms to avert, minimize, and address impacts. The message from the latest science is clear. Loss and damage is increasingly becoming one of the most significant challenges of our time, and that climate change is severely impacting on human and natural ecosystems. While many countries in the region are stepping up adaptation and mitigation efforts, people on the ground, especially those in small island developing states and least developed countries, will continue to experience significant and potentially irreversible losses. The IPCC suggests that as many as 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in countries highly vulnerable to climate impacts. My home country, the Philippines, and many other countries in our region are prone to losses and damages as a consequence of climate change. Since its establishment at COP19, the Warsaw International Mechanism has been instrumental in catalyzing knowledge and enhancing coherence, action, and support to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage associated with climate change impacts in developing countries. Its executive committee, which I currently co-chair, guides the implementation of the functions of the mechanism under overall guidance by the parties. The WIM-EXCOM has established 5 thematic expert groups for each of its work streams. Expert group on slow onset events, expert group on non-economic losses, technical expert group on comprehensive risk management, task force on displacement, expert group on action and support. All 5 thematic expert groups are operational, and they contribute their wealth of expertise and resources to advance efforts on averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage in a comprehensive and integrated manner. While the EXCOM is already mobilizing knowledge and expertise, including through the technical work of its 5 thematic expert groups, exchanges through webinars like these are vital as they help to advance awareness on the issues of loss and damage and build an understanding of regional, sub-regional, national needs on loss and damage. Responding to the complex challenge of loss and damage requires a collective effort alongside tailoring knowledge and expertise to content-specific needs, including at the regional, national, and local level. This webinar, hosted by United Nations Environment Programme, Asia Pacific Adaptation Network, and Global Adaptation Network, is a useful step in that direction. I thank the organizer and panelists from the region and beyond, and it is my pleasure to open and welcome you all to this webinar. Maraming salamat. Thank you.
Vinaka, and thank you, Jerome, for the warm welcome remarks. And it is a pleasure having the Executive Committee rep at the webinar, and thank you. I would like to now turn to Mr. Genehiro Sukada, who is the Director of Climate Change Adaptation Office at the Ministry of Environment at Government of Japan, for his welcome remarks. As a means of introduction, Mr. Genehiro Sukada has over 20 years of experience in the field of environmental administration, including that for Japan International Cooperation Agency and National Personal Authority for the Government of Japan. Mr. Sukada has also served as the Director of the Asia Pacific Network for Global Change Research Secretariat from 2019 to June 2021. The Ministry of Environment is a great supporter of the Asia Pacific Adaptation Network, as well as the Global Adaptation Network. And it is my pleasure to invite Mr. Sukada to provide his opening remarks. Mr. Sukada, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Alvin, for your warm introduction, and greetings from Tokyo, Japan. Distinguished speakers and participants, on behalf of the Ministry of the Environment, the Government of Japan, I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to this webinar. Our ministry has been supporting the Asia Pacific Adaptation Network since 2009 to mobilize adaptation and resilience knowledge in the region. In Japan, we experienced heavy rainfall, which brought floods and landslides in the wide range of area last week and this week. While looking out to the world, extreme heat has engulfed parts of Western Europe, including Spain and Portugal. And this has caused wildfires and droughts in some countries. As you already know, climate change has caused the Earth to warm by at least 1.1 degrees Celsius, and millions of people are facing the real-life consequences of higher temperatures, rising seas, fiercer storms, and unpredictable rainfall. As you may know, the general term loss and damage refers to the consequences of climate change that go beyond what people can adapt to, or when options exist but the community doesn't have the means and resources to access them. The need for a global response to this issue is indisputable. As part of its international cooperation efforts in the field of climate change adaptation, the Ministry of the Environment Japan launched the Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Information Platform, or APAN, to support decision-making for adaptation in the region in 2019. Among scientific tools developed under APAN, I'm pleased to inform you that the ClimateCast and the Climate Impact Viewer have recently been approved by the Nairobi Work Program, which is UNFCCC's Knowledge to Action Hub for Climate Resilience and Adaptation. In addition, Japan has committed to doubling adaptation finance to approximately $14.88 billion, both from public and private sectors, over 5 years from 2021 to 2025. Furthermore, Japan made approximately $6 million contribution to the Adaptation Fund in March this year for the global goal of doubling adaptation finance. I hope that this webinar will contribute to the enrichment of our understanding of loss and damage, as well as serve as a venue for healthy discussions in order to pave the way forward to climate change adaptation and building resilience. Again, I welcome all of you to this webinar and a pleasant day to all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sukada, for your warm welcome. And it is also positive to note the support and cooperation from the Ministry of Environment in the region on climate change issues, as well as your efforts to actually increase adaptation finance, as well as leadership on climate change issues. So thank you, Mr. Sukada, for your warm welcome. Colleagues, friends around the region, we have now more than over 200 participants, and we'd like to hear from you, how you are doing today and what you'd like to actually see from today's session. We'll start with a very quick Mentimeter or Zoom poll and just request colleagues to pull up the interactive session, the poll. And is there a Mentimeter? Okay, great. So you would see a pop-up screen on your on Zoom, and today's session poll will basically talk about 4 key things. We'd like to hear from you. Where are you joining us from today? So all you have to do is go on the poll and click on the right choice, whether you are from Southeast Asia, South and West Asia, East and Northeast Asia, North and Central Asia, Pacific Islands, or anywhere else outside of this region. So our first poll for today is, where are you joining us from? The second question for today for a poll is, which sector do you represent? And we have multiple sectors, and by sectors, this is basically which type of agency you represent, whether you're from government, from academia, from international organizations, from NGO, private sector, or any others we've missed. So we'd like to know where you are joining us from. And the third question we have for you is, how familiar are you with loss and damage? Whether you're an expert, you're familiar, somewhat familiar, or you are not familiar at all. And the last question we have for you today is, does loss and damage impact the way you plan, implement your work? Or if you are from one of the communities being impacted by loss and damage, happy to hear your voice as well on this. So a very quick poll, please. Helen, can I just quickly check whether we'll be viewing the results of the poll on the screen?
Yes, we can see them. You can, Vanessa, you can end the poll, I think, now.
Sure. I think we're ready to start and see where we are in terms of the poll. And while we're waiting on this, colleagues, if during the session, participants, if you have any questions, we encourage you to put your questions in the chat. And if they're directed towards any particular speakers or panelists, please name them. Okay, so majority of you are joining today from Southeast Asia. There is a small handful of participants from the Pacific Islands. Majority of the sector that is represented is from government, research and international organizations, as well as those from NGOs. So we have a really good representation on this webinar in terms of different sectors. How familiar are with loss and damage? Well, majority are somewhat familiar, and then there's about 8% that of people that are not familiar with loss and damage, and we hope that this session helps to build that understanding. Does loss and damage impact the way you plan? Yes, 67% of you feel that loss and damage impact the way you plan and implement your work. And we hope that today's session would give you a fair idea on what mechanisms you can use and what planning tools you can use to shape your work. Thank you for that poll, and we will definitely share results of the poll with the participants. Colleagues, participants, would like to now move into the first part of the webinar, which is really understanding the scientific dimension of loss and damage. And with the recently released IPCC report, AR6 on impacts, vulnerability and adaptation, we are quite fortunate to have Dr. Melanie Peary, who is a research fellow from the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions at the Australian National University, who has been researching and working and pioneering work on transformational adaptation. Her area of expertise is climate change, loss and damage, and its financing, with a focus on small island developing states. I would like to invite Melanie for a quick presentation on the status of scientific knowledge, as well as the typologies of events with a focus on the Asia Pacific region. Melanie, welcome to the session, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Alvin, for this really warm introduction. I feel really honored the way that you described me. Yes, thank you so much, very flattering. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And Alvin, thanks again for the invitation to be in this panel and webinar today. As already mentioned, my name is Melanie Pill, and I'm a research fellow at the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. And in my doctorate, I looked at financing loss and damage from climate change impacts in small island developing states. In my current project, I develop a hopefully groundbreaking framework for successful transformative adaptation projects in the Indo-Pacific region. Next, please. Yep, next. Thank you so much. Before I start, I would like to make an acknowledgement of country. And for our international audience, this is customary in Australia before undertaking public speaking to remember the traditional and rightful custodians of the land. So herewith, I acknowledge that I'm presenting to you from country that was stolen and belongs to the Dharawal people, also known as Wollongong. I acknowledge that sovereignty has never ceded. I pay my respects to all elders past, present and emerging, and welcome all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as well as other Indigenous nations that are watching here today. Next. So these are the topics that I will be talking about today in order to get us started on a conversation on loss and damage. And this includes a loss and damage definition, what that might currently look like, the different types of loss and damage that we currently identify, implications for the Asia Pacific region, followed by some key messages. I'm basing today's presentation on the most recent findings by the Working Group 2 of the IPCC report on adaptation. And it's good to see that we have a really wide range of people attending today's webinar. So I hope that the way I present is very accessible to everyone as well, because it can be quite new to a lot of people still. Okay, next, please. So unfortunately, I have to disappoint you, but there is no universally agreed definition for loss and damage. The IPCC refers to limits to adaptation or residual risks in an Asia Pacific context. Residual risk refers to the impacts that still occur after implementing all available mitigation and adaptation options. Limits to adaptation is similar and means that the risk is so high that there is no option to adapt to the impact anymore. We distinguish between hard and soft adaptation limits, where hard adaptation means that there's no adaptive action possible to avoid intolerable risks. Next, please. So we have identified, even though there's no definition, we have identified types of loss and damage that help to give a clearer picture understanding of what they could be. The UNFCCC distinguishes between extreme weather events and slow onset events. Next, please. In an Asia Pacific context, the most relevant extreme weather events are probably storm surges, tropical cyclones, floods, but also droughts. Slow onset events could be sea level rise, increasing temperatures, saltwater intrusion, ocean acidification, and glacial retreat. And we already heard loss and damage is occurring now. So I'm sure that each of you have already heard about these impacts or phenomena or even experienced them yourselves. Next, please. Then a further distinction is made between economic and non-economic losses that slow onset events and extreme weather events cause. Next, please. So economic losses are monetary losses that we are able to put a number or figure on. These could be agricultural losses or production losses caused by floods or salinization of the soil, but also tourism, infrastructure, and properties. Non-economic losses are a bit more complex, and we can't easily put a figure on them, a dollar value, because they are intangible and very personal. They're, for example, culture, life, health, indigenous knowledge, or biodiversity, something that is dear to you. It means something different to you than to everyone else. Next, please. So what do these findings mean for small islands? So there's a high confidence that there will be more intense tropical cyclones, sea level rise and storm surges, which leads to major loss and damage to human settlements, culture, and health. Change in precipitation patterns, droughts, and salinization all have an impact on food security and availability. Warmer ocean temperatures mean severe coral bleaching, and with a 2-degree global temperature increase, it means a 99% loss of corals. Changed fish migration patterns can lead to significant loss in fish catch. Invasive species increase while endemic species decline. And it is expected that these impacts will displace people and forces some to permanently move. Next, please. And there's a similar picture in Asia with some differences due to the diverse characteristics of the landscape. Rising temperatures can lead to droughts in semi-arid areas, while it means floods in monsoon regions and glacier melts in the mountainous regions of Asia. Severe water scarcity is expected along the shared rivers, and an increase in glacier lake outburst floods could also lead to migration, at least temporarily. All this has an impact also, again, on food security, deteriorated health from vector-borne diseases, and major damage to cities and settlements. Next, please. So the latest IPCC report explicitly mentions loss and damage, particularly in Chapter 17, often referred to in the context of risk management. And we do know that data is lacking, and therefore loss and damage is hard to manage, if at all, and challenging to apportion to climate change. Loss and damage remains still contentious in international negotiations and affects the poorest and most vulnerable populations disproportionately. We already heard that as well from our previous speakers. Loss and damage increases, which each 0.1 of temperature rise, and has a major impact on sustainable development in developing countries. Next, please. There are some barriers and enablers to reduce the magnitude of loss and damage occurring, though, when designing adaptation options. Current barriers and constraints to adapt include governance arrangements, financial and human resources, unavailability of baseline data that is not local enough to predict the actual loss and damage impacts, because it is quite context dependent and varies. Enablers are better governance and legal reforms, improving justice and equity concerns, especially gender inclusion, education and awareness programs, and at the same time, accessibility of climate information, localized data collection, and inclusion of indigenous knowledge. Next, please. So some of the key messages from today, or some take-home messages, are that loss and damage is occurring, and in some instances unavoidable now. Poorer countries are disproportionately affected and have less ability to cope. That's when we talk about limits to adaptation. Loss and damage increases with every 0.1 degree Celsius temperature rise. And there are enablers for adaptation options to reduce loss and damage from climate change impacts. We need strong governance in legal systems, gender inclusive adaptation, increased finance and human resource capacity, and transformational adaptation. The rethinking the way we currently live is a key in order to avert and minimize and address loss and damage from climate change impacts. Next, please. So in my dissertation, I looked into finance for loss and damage and how we can find approaches that potentially overcome the political nature of loss and damage and really help people on the ground. So if you're interested in my research and some of the ways I explored how there might be finance available for loss and damage, or how we can do that administratively, you're more than welcome to ask me questions today, or also get in touch afterwards. Next, please. Thank you so much for listening. And yeah, I'll pass over to you, Alvin.
Yeah, thank you, Melanie, for enlightening us on the scientific dimensions and also being very short and crisp in your presentation. I would encourage participants, if there's any questions for our speakers, please pop them in the chat and we will get back to you. Melanie, one of the things that I heard from you is that loss and damage increases with increased temperature rise, and near-term action can actually help limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, but it cannot eliminate all the losses and damage, not even effective adaptation. And we know that this has been a debate within the UNFCCC, particularly on the loss and damage stream. And I would like to invite our next presenter, Ms. Anna Vogt, who is the Associate Program Officer at the UN Climate Change Secretariat, and she currently works in the Loss and Damage Unit of the Climate Secretariat. Before that, she worked with the UN Environment Programme in the Western Balkans and also in the Asia Pacific region. Anna, it is my pleasure to welcome you, and please, over to you for your quick presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Alvin, for your warm introduction, and it is a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak a bit about the policy dimension, especially after we have heard in such a crisp and coherent way on the scientific dimension of loss and damage from Melanie. Next slide. So I will be talking about loss and damage from the policy dimension, of course, but especially I will be focusing on the UNFCCC process and how loss and damage and the issues related to loss and damage have evolved through time, and to see where we are now on loss and damage under the UNFCCC process. Next slide. So this first slide shows us a timeline highlighting the milestones relevant to loss and damage under the UNFCCC process. And this timeline is divided roughly into three main stages. An initial stage running from COP13 to COP18, which focused on scoping and assessment. A second stage running from COP19 to COP26, which focused on establishing the institutional setup on loss and damage, as well as launching of the technical work. And the phase that we are entering right now, where the focus is shifting on catalyzing support to respond to the needs of developing countries. Now, of course, loss and damage as a topic has been part of the negotiations of the UNFCCC from the very beginning, also before the adoption of the convention itself. But it first became part of a negotiated outcome only with the adoption of the Bali Action Plan at COP13, where loss and damage was first introduced as part of the enhanced action on adaptation. But the most significant development for loss and damage, without any doubt, came at COP19 with the establishment of the Warsaw International Mechanism. Next slide. The Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage associated with climate change impacts was established, as I said, at COP19 in 2013. It was established to be, and has later been reaffirmed by the Paris Agreement, as the main vehicle under the UNFCCC process to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage associated with climate change impacts in developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change in a comprehensive, integrated, and coherent manner. Next slide. And the Warsaw International Mechanism does so by implementing its three functions. The first one is enhancing knowledge and understanding of comprehensive risk management approaches to address loss and damage, including slow onset impacts, by facilitating and promoting action to address gaps in the understanding of and expertise in approaches to address loss and damage, collecting, sharing, management, and use of relevant data and information, provision of overviews of best practices, challenges, experiences, and lessons learned. And the second function, which is strengthening dialogue, coordination, coherence, and synergies among relevant stakeholders by providing leadership and coordination, and where appropriate also oversight under the Convention on the assessment and implementation of approaches to address loss and damage, and fostering dialogue, coordination, coherence, and synergies among all relevant stakeholders, including initiatives outside the Convention. And finally, the third function, which focuses on enhancing action and support, including finance, technology, and capacity building to address loss and damage, and enable countries to undertake relevant actions, including by providing technical support and guidance on approaches to address loss and damage, providing information and recommendations for consideration by parties when providing guidance relevant to reducing the risk of loss and damage, and where necessary addressing loss and damage, and facilitating the mobilization and securing the expertise and enhancement of support, including finance, technology, and capacity building to strengthen existing approaches, and where necessary, facilitate the development and implementation of additional approaches to address loss and damage. Next slide. COP19 has also established the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism, which is mandated to guide the implementation of the functions of the WIM. The EXCOM is comprised of 20 members, and it meets at least twice a year to report its progress annually to the parties through the subsidiary bodies. It has also been empowered to establish expert groups and has so far established 5 expert groups on slow onset events, on non-economic losses, a technical expert group on comprehensive risk management, a task force on displacement, and an expert group on action and support. And what is important to note is that now the EXCOM has a fully operational and established expert group under each of its 5 strategic work streams of its work plan. The EXCOM has also established a WIM roster of experts, which contributes a wealth of knowledge and expertise to co-develop and support the work of the WIM. Next slide. This slide gives us a visual representation of the WIM ecosystem, and it highlights how vital collaboration is for the work of the Executive Committee and for the Warsaw International Mechanism in general. This is collaboration with other constituent bodies under the UNFCCC, which collaborate with the EXCOM on thematic areas of relevance to loss and damage, but also through the membership of select constituent bodies in the expert groups themselves, and also collaboration with external entities and experts through their membership in the expert groups, through their participation in the Fiji Clearinghouse on risk transfer, and through the Santiago network. Next slide. Focusing more on the Fiji Clearinghouse for risk transfer, COP21 has first requested the Executive Committee to establish it, but it was only established at COP23 with the name Fiji Clearinghouse for risk transfer when it was actually launched. It serves as a repository for information on insurance and risk transfer in order to facilitate the efforts of parties to develop and implement comprehensive risk management strategies. And what is important about the Fiji Clearinghouse is that it catalyzes action and support by non-state actors as well, especially those from the insurance industry, including the private sector, by directly connecting those that seek assistance with those providing solutions, and also by enhancing knowledge and understanding of risk transfer solutions in the context of climate risk management. Next slide. Then focusing a bit more on the Santiago network. The Santiago network was established as a result of the second review of the WIM at COP25 CMA2, and its aim is to catalyze technical assistance of relevant organizations, bodies, networks, and experts for the implementation of relevant approaches to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. And the focus here is at the national, regional, but also local level in developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. While the institutional arrangements of the Santiago network are still very much being negotiated, the Secretariat has the interim mandate to provide support for developing countries that may wish to seek technical assistance that is available under the Santiago network. Next slide. And focusing a bit more on the latest outcomes and state of affairs, looking at the outcomes of COP26, there have been a number of outcomes which are very much of relevance to the loss and damage issue. The WIM EXCOM related ones, of course, the recommendations that have been based on the progress of implementation of the work at the EXCOM have been adopted, but technical assistance for loss and damage has very much been a big topic at COP26, with the functions of the Santiago network having been adopted, and with a clear process for the further development of institutional arrangements also having been adopted at COP26. Regarding the finance for loss and damage, this has also been a big topic on discussion on COP26, with the COP deciding not only that the Santiago network needs to be provided with funds to support the technical assistance for the implementation of relevant approaches for loss and damage, but also with the establishment of the Glasgow Dialogue. Next slide. Now these are just the functions of the Santiago network, but we don't really have time to look at them into detail. Next slide. Next slide, please. Looking at what has happened in after COP26, regarding the mandate of COP26, there have been a couple of important developments regarding the Santiago network. The COP26 has invited parties and relevant organizations to submit their views on the operational modalities, structure, role of the EXCOM and its expert group, and the role of loss and damage and contact points and other relevant stakeholders, as well as possible elements of TORs for a potential convening or coordinating body that might provide secretarial services for the Santiago network. These were all received through the through the submission portal and have been considered in the technical workshop that the Secretariat was requested to organize under the guidance of the chairs of the SPI and SAPSTA, with inputs from the Executive Committee, and which has taken place in Copenhagen in May. This workshop has also resulted in an informal information note by the chairs of the SPI and the SAPSTA. And all this has been reflected in the outcome of SB 56 in June, where the adopted draft conclusions took note of the submissions from parties and organizations on the institutional arrangements of the Santiago network. And they welcomed the technical workshop and took note of the informal information note, and also initiated the considerations of institutional arrangements of the Santiago network. But these are still very much under negotiations, and parties have agreed to continue the consideration of the matter at SB 57 in November. Next slide. And finally, on the Glasgow Dialogue, this has also been established by COP26 to provide opportunities for party and non-party stakeholders to contribute to the deliberations on funding arrangements in the context of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage in an open, inclusive, and non-prescriptive manner. The Glasgow Dialogue really strives to bring together a broad range of stakeholders in a pragmatic discussion on the arrangements for financing of activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage by giving visibility to frontline communities and those most vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. It is a process, so it's not just the dialogue that has taken place in June, but there will be 2 additional dialogues at SB 58 and SB 60. But the first one has already taken place in June over 3 half days, and it has been a combination of plenary and breakout discussions that have been steered by guiding questions prepared by the WIM EXCOM, and which provided a space to reflect on good practices, challenges, and lessons learned of the existing finance to better understand how support can be more responsive to those that are the needs of vulnerable countries. And
thanks, Anna. You have 1 minute to wrap up.
No, I'm wrapping up. So this was the last slide. Thank you for your attention, and apologies for having taken a couple of minutes more, but it is quite a substantive topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna, and much appreciated. We know the developments in Santiago network and the Glasgow Dialogue is an important one, and to provide more perspectives on that, Colin McQuiston from Practical Action will provide civil society perspectives on the Santiago network and Glasgow Dialogue. But Anna, thank you so much for your input. Dear participants, colleague, we have now more than 240 participants and questions are flowing in. We will have a Q&A session later, but Melanie, there is a pressing question for you, and this is from Gusti. Would you be able to provide specific examples of loss and damage in developing countries? Very briefly, Melanie, over to you.
Can I just clarify whether you mean like actual events that already happened? Is that what you mean, or generic, or what I've spoken about?
Perhaps this would be examples of loss and damage events, and maybe touching a bit on the clusters of non-economic or economic losses that you would have observed from your research.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So one thing that always occurs to me in the Pacific region, what I always find astonishing, is that we now had, I think since Cyclone Pam, a category 5 hurricane every single year, and I think there was only one year where we didn't have one in the Pacific region that didn't hit any islands. So I think this is a really a good example of how climate change exacerbates things like extreme weather events and tropical cyclones. Another example that I looked at was in the Caribbean, even though not the Pacific, but still islands, the unprecedented hurricane season in 2017, where we had so many hurricanes in a row that were 4 or stronger and almost hit all of the Caribbean region. So I think these events really show that they are out of the ordinary, and that we can no longer say that this is normal weather, so to speak. And then in terms of sorry, Alvin.
Thank you. No, that's a really good example. There's questions also for Anna, and I just want to direct a question to Anna. And this is from Krishni Narayan. At COP26, many developed countries, including the Pacific Island nations, called for a loss and damage facility to address the lack of finance to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. And the question over here, which I just lost, is how viable is such a facility? So Anna, maybe this question over to you, but also if Jerome from EXCOM is also here, perhaps he could also touch on work around financing that is happening at the EXCOM. So Anna and Jerome, please.
Thank you for the question. Well, I think it's very important to remember that the UNFCCC is a process that is based on the consensus. So everything that countries are able to reach consensus on becomes de facto viable. The issue with the establishment of a loss and damage facility and the opinions that have been raised by countries that have not let's say, embraced the call for the establishment of such a facility is the fact that loss and damage seems to be a very urgent issue, and the establishment of something new, especially in a process such as the UNFCCC, is something that might divert time and resources from more immediate and maybe easier steps to provide meaningful action and support to countries. So this was in brief, but I don't know if Jerome would like to complement that.
I have a feeling that we might have lost Jerome in the process, but we do have more discussions on the UNFCCC processes and Santiago network later over the session. What I would encourage Anna and Melanie is if you can go on the Q&A. There's as many as 30 questions now, and they are directed towards you two. Perhaps participants, we can now move on to the actual mechanisms and hear from country delegates and participants on mechanisms and approaches to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. And we now move into a panel conversation, which will involve a representative from Bangladesh, from Fiji, also representing rest of the AOSIS and small island developing states, and also from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. I would like to first start with Mr. Hafiz Khan, who is an advocate at the Supreme Court of Bangladesh and coordinator for loss and damage team. He is also a member of the executive committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism, as well as his work around LDC's climate change group at UNFCCC. Mr. Khan, I would like to start first with you. Can you tell us about loss and damage in Bangladesh and what impacts vulnerable communities in your country are facing? Mr. Khan, over to you. Hafiz, sorry, you are on mute. If you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that. Thank you so much, Alvin, colleagues and friends. A very good afternoon from Bangladesh. And it is my really great privilege to share some of my experiences related to loss and damage resulting from climate change in the context of Bangladesh. In line with, of course, what the questions Alvin asked for me. So, colleagues, you know, I'm basically a community lawyer working for last 20 years here in Bangladesh. So with that experience, I would like to share some of my thoughts, particularly focusing on the governance issues of loss and damage at the micro level as a lawyer. And this bottom-up governance approach, those also can provide some guidance to the shaping the international policy framework, and what Anna was elaborating in the earlier session. Colleagues, we already heard my previous speaker, Melanie. She was telling us very clearly the nature and the types of loss and damage and what sort of governance challenges at this moment the small island countries and including least developing countries we are facing. So let us try to understand the basic impacts and vulnerabilities. Those are associated with slow onset processes like saline water intrusion. For example, just 2 days back here in Bangladesh, it was a very unusual high tide that resulted the coastal flooding. So now these sort of high tides are observed very frequently that are causing the coastal flooding and coastal erosions. So the scientific communities, including IPCC, clearly stated that, that about the sea level rise and its associated impacts on the high tides. So that is now visible here in Bangladesh. Colleagues, in terms of, you see in terms of slow onset processes like sea level rise, how these are causing harm to the vulnerable communities and ecosystems. At the same time, if we look at the sudden onset events like floods, then again, just recently Bangladesh faced a massive flood due to flash floods in the region. It was the heavy rainfall within the last 122 years. It was the highest rainfall that caused the flash flood and resulted to the flash floods. So if we look at these floods, if we try to identify the nature of loss and damage, Melanie was saying about talking about the definitions. Friends and colleagues, I know as a negotiator how difficult to agree on a definition, but that is not only a political challenge, that is also a technical challenge, how to define and what elements should be there to define a loss and damage terminology. That's a big challenge. However, at the moment, we need to understand what is the nature of loss and damage. If you look at the current flash flood in Bangladesh, it caused a loss of lives, unfortunately. It caused damage to infrastructure, properties, and of course it damaged huge crops, and it damaged particularly the institutions, including academic institutions, that is resulted to damage to education. And unfortunately, it would cause some displacement. Whenever the displacement takes place, then there are so many important non-economic loss and damage involved, like loss of territories, loss of values, cultures. Those are very critical. So if you look at one incident of this flood, we can try to understand the nature of the loss and damage. Once we can understand the nature of the loss and damage, we can then try to identify needs of the governance. My colleague Melina was talking about the better governance. We would like to say, to some extent, innovative governance approaches are needed to deal with this sort of loss and damage. Before exploring some of the innovative or better governance, let me share some of the examples from Bangladesh, which current state of governance structure exists in Bangladesh. Colleagues, you know, there is an Environmental Act that was adopted in 1995 that gives us a broader scope to address the environmental harm. And that particular legislation provides us as the vulnerable communities to take legal action against the polluters, but even it is focusing on environment. But I say due to slow onset processes and sudden onset events, it causes huge damage to environment, including ecosystem and the biodiversity. So this Conservation Act give us broader perspective to bring the loss and damage issue before the courts. Secondly, I would like to mention that Bangladesh government also adopted Disaster Management Act back in 2012 that interestingly recognized the climate-induced disaster. That is for the more adopted a provision, the disaster victims can claim compensation before the local courts. That's very interesting provision. Even it is not yet institutionalized these sort of provisions, but that gives a huge scope at the national level. And we all know that NAPA was for National Adaptation Plan of Action, that was for LDCs, Bangladesh government adopted back in 2005. And that talks of the impacts and vulnerabilities and how it would cause the potential damage and losses related to communities and ecosystems. Then Bangladesh government secondly adopted Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan. That was a strategy and action plan for 10 years. And that clearly identified loss and damage that Bangladesh government needs to deal with in collaboration with the different actors, like including the communities. So that strategy is now updating. Government is updating that strategy now. By this time, government submitted NDC, National Determined Contribution under the Paris Agreement. The first NDCs now reviewed last year in 2021. Unfortunately, NDCs of government did not mention loss and damage. We might consider it for the future review of this NDC. And Bangladesh government is now currently developing the NAP, National Adaptation Plan, where I'm also working as a legal expert. In this formulation process, we identified so many sectors and avenues to address the loss and damage issues. And NAP needs to identify the limits of adaptation and to identify the issues that Dr. Melanie was talking of, the residual damage that IPCC clearly identified, that is disproportionate impacts on the communities, particularly from the least developing countries and states. So these are the current state, and what are the challenges? To be honest,
I have been sorry, you have 1 minute to wrap up here, and this is a very interesting conversation.
Yeah, Alvin, how much? How many minutes?
So you have 1 more minute.
Okay, 1 minute is enough. Okay, then I would talk some of the innovative approaches. First of all, we need to conduct a comprehensive need assessment at the country level. Second, we need to identify right tools and methods to assess the existing and potential risk related to loss and damage. Thirdly, we need to identify the right approaches, and those approaches needs to be institutionalized with legislative mandate. So these are the governance processes that must be taken by vulnerable countries like Bangladesh. And second challenge, this bottom-up approach might be a national mechanism. Now question how the Warsaw International Mechanism can provide guidance and inputs to meet the needs of vulnerable communities, vulnerable ecosystems, and vulnerable states. This is how it needs to be linked with national level mechanism to the international level mechanism, that is Warsaw International Mechanism. So loss and damage now is a very critical stage in terms of shaping the governance process at the international level, at the same time national level. So we need to focus much more on governance issues with particular focus on action and support, that is including finance, technology, and capacity building. Let me stop here. Colleagues, I'd be happy to respond further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hafiz, for the very interesting and intriguing input from Bangladesh perspective. And there is a very interesting conversation that's happening on this side in Q&A. And Salim has just raised this issue from ICAD, whether it makes sense to continue to include avert and minimize as part of the range of tackling loss and damage, and whether it's time now just to confine ourselves to address loss and damage only. I think this is a very interesting perspective, Salim, to add to what Hafiz had to say. I would encourage more questions to come through, and we will definitely make time to answer some of these during the Q&A session. I would now turn to our speaker and panelist from Fiji, Philemone Tuivanualevu. He is the IOSIS Fellow and a Senior Climate Change Adaptation Officer at the Climate Change and International Cooperation Division from the Ministry of Economy in Fiji. Philemone Bula, and welcome. Maybe you could start with what is the situation for Pacific Small Island developing states when it comes to loss and damage, and what sort of mechanisms and approaches are being considered in the sub-region. Philemone, over to you.
Bula Vinaka Elvin, great to have a fellow Fiji Islander here as well, and always a pleasure. Bula and hello to you all joining in from my island home in Fiji and from across the globe. As many of you have heard from the previous speakers, the situation for SIDS and particular Pacific SIDS, where I come from, we greatly understand and live the experience of loss and damage on a day-to-day, growing up from a kid and seeing how things have escalated to where we are at now. I think one of the previous speakers had briefly spoke about the situation in the Pacific Small Island developing states in terms of the loss and damages that we experience quite frequently. And I'll just list a few. For the Pacific, we mainly have the issues of tropical cyclones, of course, the rise in sea level, ocean acidification, prolonged dry seasons, and of course, prolonged rainfalls, which causes flooding. Some of you may know the country of Kiribati, located in the Pacific, have recently declared a state of emergency due to a prolonged dry season, which they are currently experiencing, and which they have had an increase in salinity levels in their drinking water, which their government has had to declare a state of emergency and call out to their development partners and the neighboring countries to assist them in providing the basic need of water. And I think that in itself paints a picture of the reality that we are facing in the Pacific. In Fiji, we had experienced one of the strongest, the strongest on record tropical cyclone to ever hit the Southern Hemisphere. It wiped a third of our GDP in a period of 36 hours. And that is just the situation that we are living with. Flooding, prolonged rainfalls for Fiji is an annual occurrence. There's flooding in flood-prone areas, and we have tried to adapt to it to the capacity that we can, being a small island developing state. But there's just so much we can do, and that as well with the rising sea level. We have relocated some communities, a total of 6 communities, with about 40 communities still on the wait list, which is quite alarming. And our financial capabilities can only allow us to do so much. But nonetheless, we will continue to endeavor on. Alvin, do you want me to continue to the second question due to the time limit that we have?
Yes, Philemone, 1 minute, over to you.
Okay, so the second question which I was assigned was just on what we have done in Fiji in terms of on the policy level. So in Fiji, we have due to the relocation of communities, this is a state-driven mechanism. So the government of Fiji released the climate relocation and displaced, the climate relocation guidelines, and also the displacement guidelines. This is just to help coordinate stakeholders and agencies that actually relocate communities. As we talk about with the relocation, we also are talking about non-economic losses in terms of losses to their traditions and their cultures, which, we're moving a group of people to another new area, and that in itself is a loss on various magnitudes of people's history. Being from the Pacific, it is something we hold dear. The land that has been given to us by our ancestors, and these non-economic losses are quite paramount that we also try and address, in addition to the economic losses. Additionally, we also have the Fiji Climate and Relocation of Displaced People Trust Fund that was established by our government in order for us to finance this relocation processes that we need. So what the government of Fiji did is we have it's called in Fiji the Environment and Climate Levy, which we tax certain prescribed goods and services, mostly luxury goods. There's a certain tax that is imposed by our government on them, and a percentage of that is put into this trust fund to assist in the work that we do in relocating communities. Additionally, this fund also helps us with our development partners as a way to channel in their assistance or their aid in terms of having something available to be accountable for whatever assistance is coming in from our development partners. This has also been further mandated through the Fiji's Climate Change Act, which was enacted by our parliament late last year. If there's anything else, please send forward your questions, and I'm happy to answer if need be. Thank you.
Vinaka Philemone, it's always a pleasure hearing from the Pacific sub-region, and also this theme of non-economic losses. It's coming very clearly from the couple of country presenters we've had, and a very interesting perspective from Aspen, from SPC, from the region. There seems to be some uncertainty in the region on what loss and damage is. Is it really unavoidable loss and damage, or is it loss and damage from a lack of adaptation resources, finance and technology? And perhaps Melanie, if I can indulge you to perhaps respond to Aspen. But I would very quickly now turn to our next speaker, Raymond Zing. And Raymond Zing is the Regional Coordinator for Anticipatory Action in Asia Pacific. Raymond works for the IFRC, and he has 10 years of experience at the country and regional level. Raymond, very quickly over to you, and what we'd like to hear from your perspective is perhaps start with what do you think is the role of the humanitarian organizations and networks, particularly organizations such as IFRC in terms of addressing loss and damage. And I'm just going to limit myself to addressing loss and damage over here. 5 minutes, Raymond, to you.
Good, thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me. I'm Raymond from IFRC Asia Pacific Regional Office. Maybe for those who don't know, IFRC, we're the largest humanitarian network connecting 192 Red Cross national society to save lives and livelihoods at the local and national level. Well, yeah, thank you so much for inviting us, representing also a bit the humanitarian side in this discussion. I think that's a bit what I probably can contribute to this webinar. I mean, I'm not going to repeat what people have said. Yes, the loss of lives and livelihoods is already a reality today, and as was mentioned, the UNFCCC negotiations are focused on how to avert, minimize, and address losses and damages. But maybe to turn that a bit into our language, what we, I guess, would say in the humanitarian field would be how can we prevent, reduce, and respond to the impacts of the climate crisis. And humanitarian partners, and particularly IFRC, are investing more in preparedness, which includes scaling up anticipatory action. Many disaster management systems have already become more anticipatory, responding to forecasts to enable early action, minimizing or even reducing the loss and damage of a particular hazard. But these approaches also need to be available in more communities for different types of hazards and a much greater scale, which I'll talk about in a bit. But maybe just to shift a bit the focus on anticipatory action, because I think that is a really interesting and promising approach to talk about loss and damage. So from IFRC side, we support our Red Cross National Society to set up early action protocols. These are basically predefined SOPs that tell our national societies, but also local actors and our volunteers what to do when, based on what forecast and how much money is needed for that. All of that is already pre-agreed and pre-financed. So for example, what we need, some of the key components are the trigger. We need to understand when is the impact of a hazard going to occur. So it's not just the forecast, it is impact-based forecasting. For that, we need to understand the local vulnerability and exposure, because, for example, 1 meter of flood water has a different impact in different parts of the country. And then also the early actions. What are the best early actions that we can do adapted to that local context? And also then the ex-ante financing. All of these 3 components is what we put into our anticipatory action approach. And most importantly, all of this is done before the disaster strikes, before the main impact of the hazard occurs. So that means looking at a forecast that can range between a few days, sometimes even hours, to several weeks, and sometimes months, depending on the hazard. And this is really our window of opportunity to avert and minimize the impending hazard impacts. Just to give you a bit of an idea, in Asia Pacific, we're working on anticipatory action and have set up 6 of these early action protocols at the moment in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia for different hydromet hazards such as typhoons, cyclones, floods, and also zooms and cold waves. We've also had several activations of our early action protocols, and we have gained really useful learnings and evidence that we can use again for further advocacy with governments. I just want to give you one really practical example from the Philippines, where the Philippine Red Cross has a early action protocol for typhoons, and this is set up together with local actors such as local government units, but also our volunteers and others. and they have identified different early actions based on the local context of the different islands. So for example, on one island, if a typhoon hits one island, the early action will be early harvesting of abaca trees, because that is the impact on that island. But if the same typhoon hits a different island, our early action will, for example, be shelter strengthening kits to address the destruction of houses caused by the wind. So really, we need to understand the impact at the local level. And I think that is something that one of my previous speakers actually mentioned, that this is very challenging. Yes, it is very challenging, but that is exactly what we need. Otherwise, our ways of, I guess, averting and minimizing loss and damage is just too broad. But maybe also to mention that we don't work in isolation. We normally implement together, or we aim to implement together with partners from the UN, of course, also from the governments. We work with national hydromet services to set up these triggers, because only together we can really scale up anticipatory action, which is probably our biggest challenge. We need to be much bigger to have the impact that we really need. In Asia Pacific, we also have a regional technical working group on anticipatory action that brings together all the partners working on anticipatory action, really to harmonize and advance our approach and to align also our programming. Also, ASEAN, for example, is part of our technical working group, and ASEAN has just published its anticipatory action framework, which outlines the key building blocks that I just mentioned. So there is a trigger, so a kind of risk understanding, there's the anticipatory action, what are we doing before, and also the financing. And this is quite an exciting framework for us, because it really, again, harmonizes, streamlines, and allows us to scale up anticipatory action the approach across ASEAN. I think I've already approached my 5 minutes. I can talk a bit more about
we will definitely invite you to talk a bit more on that during the Q&A. But interesting perspective in terms of early warning systems, and participants and colleagues, you would know that the Secretary General has announced the importance of early warnings and action to save lives. And to that end, the Secretary General has announced the UN will spearhead new action to ensure every person on Earth is protected by early warning system within 5 years. And this is a very bold statement, but also a bold action for partners in terms of providing climate services and action across the globe. Thank you, Raymond, for that input. And I know that we are running short of time, and I would just indulge on extending the webinar for another 15 to 20 minutes. Very interesting conversations on the sides. I would definitely want to give the participants an opportunity to ask the questions. I will now turn to the civil society perspectives on international policy mechanisms, particularly on the Santiago network for loss and damage and the Glasgow Dialogue, and what are the expectations for COP27. As many would know, COP26 had created a 2-year Glasgow Dialogue for parties to discuss possible arrangements for loss and damage funding. And the first discussion was actually convened by the chairs of the subsidiary bodies in June 2020. To that end, I would like to now invite Colin McChryston, who is the head of climate and resilience at the Practical Action. Colin has been following the UNFCCC Conference of Parties since 2014. He's an observer of the UNFCCC Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. He has expertise in sustainable development, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation. Colin, the floor is over to you. And I would like to remind participants, please keep your questions coming, and Colin will be providing civil society perspectives. Over to you, Colin. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alvin, and it's great to be here. And I'm really impressed with not only the quality of the presentations, but also the excellent questions that you're bringing through. So let's go to the next slide. And you can skip, so my contact details are in the slides. Continue to the next slide. So this is just a quick outline. I'm going to focus on the Glasgow Dialogue and the Santiago Network, and I'm also going to highlight, I think, some areas where civil society can contribute to really making progress. So let's move ahead. Next slide. So before I start, there is a lot of details in these slides. I'm not going to spend time going into the details, but they are there for all of the participants to catch up later and really give you a bigger overview of these important initiatives for loss and damage. So I think the first thing is really to sort of highlight something that's been stressed by many of the previous speakers, and that is that loss and damage, avert, minimize, and address loss and damage covers already a whole lot of the development space. We're talking about actions before disasters happen. We're talking about emergency response. We're talking about recovery. We're talking about disaster risk reduction. And we're talking about long-term development, including building forward better. And I think the important thing to bear in mind that's been highlighted by many of the previous speakers is that climate impacts are increasing in intensity, they're increasing in frequency. So therefore, the old adage, after the flood is always before the next flood, is true, but now means that you're getting a flood once every year or maybe 2 years, where you used to get them once every 10 years. So yes, please move on to the next slide. So the Santiago Network. So in response, and we've heard this from Anna, the UNFCCC established the Warsaw International Mechanism in 2013. The Warsaw International Mechanism was initially established, as Salim has highlighted in the chat box, to address loss and damage. And I think the important thing in the previous slide with that continuum of the operational space around loss and damage is really to stress it's not where we have existing mechanisms that it's important. It's really to highlight where the gaps occur. Where are the gaps in the system? Where are the people who are falling through those gaps? And what can we do to respond to those gaps and to help those people who are being impacted? And that's the whole idea behind the Santiago Network. So as we've heard, it was initially agreed at COP25 in 2019, and there was more substantial work made in Glasgow at COP26. And we're really talking about the central pillar of these three pillars under the Warsaw International Mechanism that you can see in this slide here. So we've got the policy arm, we've got the executive committee. That was established in 2013. As Anna highlighted, it's taken the executive committee nearly 9 years to get all of the expert groups under the executive committee operational and doing the work that they have been tasked with. But for the last 9 years, we've had the policy arm. And what we've lacked is we've lacked the operational arm, and of course, we've lacked the financial arm. So this slide pulls together the role of the Santiago Network as this body to catalyze technical assistance to developing countries facing either unavoided impacts, countries do not have the capacity or the resources to adapt, or those impacts that are now due to climate change, 1.1 degrees on average, in many places maybe more than that, those irreversible impacts that can no longer be adapted to. And that's the Santiago Network. But of course, if we've got a technical body, if we've got established this technical assistance function that supports communities facing irreversible climate impact, the next challenge will be, how do we resource it? We don't want the Santiago Network to be an empty shell. We want it to be fit for function, fit for purpose, and able to deliver to those communities on the front lines. Next slide, please. So this brings us into this operational space, the policy space around how do we make sure that the policy arm, the operational arm, and the finances are able to flow. So civil society came together before COP26 and came up with a proposition prior to COP26 of what a financial mechanism for loss and damage could look like. At COP26, we heard during the first week, the G77, the largest negotiating group representing over 85% of the global population, made the call for the Glasgow Loss and Damage Finance Facility. Now, sadly, that idea was not accepted. It was not included in the agenda for the negotiations, and instead an agreement was made to have this Glasgow Dialogue. But next slide, please. I just wanted to frame how the Loss and Damage Finance Facility could operate. And the thing to bear in mind is it needs to operate both in terms of the operations under the Warsaw International Mechanism, but also under the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC. Because the important thing is we're trying to emphasize that, yes, disasters have been happening around the world. They are going to continue to happen. Humanitarian crises as a result of political instability are going to continue. Earthquakes are going to continue to devastate communities. The humanitarian community, the disaster risk reduction community are already operating at full capacity. What we need is an additional mechanism, and that's why the Loss and Damage Finance Facility is essential. And these next few slides just highlight some of the important functions on which this Loss and Damage Finance Facility needs to be established. It needs to be delivering assistance to climate impacted communities. It needs to be driven by those countries that are facing the consequences of the climate emergency. We heard already from Philemore, 6 communities in Fiji have been relocated. They've got 40 countries on the waiting list. Now, I imagine if we had a Loss and Damage Finance Facility with funding that was operational, maybe 10 of those 40 communities would no longer be on the waiting list, but would be removed from harm's way. So next slide, please. We need to ensure that this mechanism is effectively managed. It needs to be responding to the climate impacts that are exacerbated by increased global warming. We know that we've got this 1.5 degree target. We know we've got 5, 6, 7 years remaining to stay within that barrier. But at 1.1, loss and damages are already occurring and they're happening around the world. So the Loss and Damage Finance Facility would need to meet an effective secretariat to decide the operations of the fund. It would need an effective decision-making body, but again, probably would need to have linkages into the Santiago network to ensure that the best available technical knowledge is informing where that financing is going. Next slide, please. And as several speakers have mentioned, we've got rapid onset events, which even with the best available science, we are not 100% sure that we can predict. So the finance facility would need to have an urgent response window for those catastrophes that we don't see or we don't respond to in time. But equally, we've got these slow onset events. We've got sea level rise. We've got melting glaciers destroying water resources. We need a mechanism that works on a slow onset event. So, I mean, one of the challenges there is that you could be looking maybe at a project-based approach that would work for slow onset events, but it wouldn't work for rapid onset. So how can the funding windows under the Loss and Damage Finance Facility operate effectively? We need to make sure that the access modalities are suitable for communities on the front line. One of the lessons learned from the Green Climate Fund is that this accreditation process really filters out organizations that have limited technical or proposal writing capacities. And we need to make sure that the allocations are responding to the needs on the ground. Next slide, please. So how can civil society help? With the Santiago network, the two critical issues are the hosting agency, who is going to host the body, but the most important thing is the advisory function. We need to make sure that the advisory body of the Santiago network is fit for purpose and ensures that the funding goes where it is needed. And then on the Glasgow Dialogue, I think the most important thing is the funding sources to ensure that it is demand-driven responding to needs, but we also need to ensure that we've got an adequate political space to talk about the Glasgow Dialogue within the UNFCCC process. Next slide, please. So How can civil society help? Well, talk to your national governments. Please engage those governments and make sure they are speaking out in the UNFCCC, that they are supporting initiatives that drive progress on both the Santiago network and on the loss and damage finance facility. We need to ensure that civil society is supporting negotiating group positions in the UNFCCC, and there's a variety of ways that can be done. And we also need to make sure that outside the negotiations, that the pressure is kept on the politicians. As we've heard from many of our speakers, time is taken in political debate, and that time is consuming the time where people on the front lines of the climate emergency need the assistance that they're not getting at the moment. Next slide, please. So thank you very much. And I'd just like to highlight three particular documents that I think would be really valuable for the group. First of all, please do join the Loss and Damage Collaboration, and it is literally lossandDamageCollaboration. And I think it's org. Let me just check that one, so that you can stay up to date. Yes, it's Loss and Damage, lossandDamageCollaboration.org, all as one word. Excellent set of resources on there. Oxfam recently produced a report, Fair Finance for Loss and Damage in the era of escalating climate impacts. It's a great report. It was produced just prior to COP26. It really highlights how the humanitarian system is not an adequate response to escalating loss and damage. And finally, the Loss and Damage Finance Facility paper from which my slides were taken, that is available on the Climate Action Network, on Christian Aid, on Heinrich Boll, and on Stamp Out Poverty, as well as Practical Action's website. It's been a great to speak to you all today, and I look forward to the Q&A session at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. It is always a pleasure hearing you, and definitely a very forward-looking vision for the Santiago network, as well as the financing facility that the civil society group has. I understand many of the discussions are still happening within the UNFCCC, and much of this will be carried forward at the upcoming COP27. Colleagues, participants, indulging again for your patience, another 10 minutes, and this 10 minutes is over to you, the questions that you have posed. So I would like to invite Hafiz very quickly, and perhaps Colin, on this question. Can you provide an update regarding the funding of the Santiago network and progress of Glasgow Dialogue? What, if anything, do you expect will be discussed in relation to loss and damage at COP27? So Hafiz, perhaps from the perspective of Bangladesh, but also being part of the EXCOM, what are the expectations? And then Colin, over to you, maybe what are the expectations from CSO?
Alvin?
Hafiz, sorry. Yeah. The question is, what are the expectations in relation to loss and damage at COP27?
Okay. Thanks, Alvin. It's a very good question. You know, I'm involved with the least developing countries group loss and damage team as a co-coordinator. So let us share some of my thoughts as a negotiator, also being a governance worker for loss and damage. So COP27 is very critical in terms of agreeing on the effective institutional structure on Santiago network that can deliver the functions agreed at COP26 effectively. This is the big ask. Second, all the vulnerable developing countries under the umbrella of G77 China, all we agreed to establish a financial facility that can facilitate all the relevant activities related to loss and damage, not only the Santiago network. But at the same time, while we are structuring the Santiago network institutions, then we must adopt some financial mechanisms so that those funding arrangement or financial mechanisms can provide financial support to the OBNEs and also national governments. So this is how Santiago network needs to be structured with funding arrangements. Secondly, financial facility would be a big ask for us. Thirdly, we need to settle the governance issues. We do see the COP and CMA decisions and decisions related to Warsaw International Mechanism getting priority in the COP decisions. So that is slowly is governance issue is trying to be placed. However, without prejudging anything, I think all the parties of the convention and the Paris Agreement, we need to engage politically, technically to agree on this so that we cannot prejudge or we cannot make any confusion. So these are the three bigger issues we are expecting to be settled at COP27. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Hafiz. And Colin, may I just invite you in terms of the CSO perspectives and expectations on loss and damage for COP27?
Yeah, thanks, Alvin and Hafiz, fully support. I mean, basically, we've got to ensure that the loss and damage finance facility is on the agenda at COP27. It's not adequate to limit it to the subsidiary body meetings, which happen in June, the technical discussions. We need to have the political discussions. We need to have those discussions about where are the problems, where are the barriers, and what can we do about it. And I think the important, or the emphasis why this is essential is, if we don't come up with a loss and damage finance facility very quickly, then developing countries are going to have to invest more of their resources in responding to these climate disasters, and they're not going to use those resources to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a lose-lose for everybody, because they are going to suffer exacerbated climate impact. They're not going to be able to escalate the mitigation measures that are needed to avert climate catastrophe. I think the second and third points that I'd just like to quickly make is we need more than just the technical assistance. It's not going to be enough if your house is destroyed by a climate event, a cyclone, that the architect comes along and tells you how to build back the house so that the next cyclone isn't going to destroy it. You also need the investment to be able to rebuild the house the way that the architect decides. So it's not just about technical assistance, it's about providing the resources that you need to rebuild the house in a way that ensures that the next cyclone doesn't destroy it the same as previous. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. And that's a really nice knowledge in terms of, technical assistance to go hand in hand with the resources. There's also an interesting question from Arun Shrestha, and we heard Raymond talk about understanding impact at the local level. Raymond, maybe I could indulge you in this question. How different is loss and damage assessment from risk assessment, and whether you'd be able to suggest a good resource for loss and damage assessment method? Raymond, if I can invite you to answer this question, please.
Yeah, thanks for that. Maybe first a bit to talk about the, I guess, impact at the local level, right? What we try to do is really to have a, I guess, holistic understanding of the impact of a hazard in different locations based on vulnerabilities. And what we need for that is really the involvement of national societies, but also of local communities. But then again, for example, National Hydromet Services, because they have the forecasts that we need to again then understand where the impact of a hazard strikes most severely. So I guess it's really a combination of having that local and indigenous knowledge, but then I would also go a step further. I guess it's not just about understanding impact, but then what can we do about it, which is which needs to be equally localized in that sense. As I mentioned, for example, an example from the Philippines, I think that is the best way of describing. Yes, we need to have, I guess, measures that really make sense for those, for the most vulnerable and those most affected. In terms of, I guess, risk assessment, I'm not sure if I'm the right person for the best methodology on that. I can, of course, tell you more about how cluster present societies do their risk assessments, starting from engagement of communities to understanding past impact. Yeah, but I think maybe others if you wanted really to have then that comparison with the loss and damage risk assessment. On the other hand, as I said, I guess our terminology is probably more about reducing impact, responding, and also minimizing. Yeah, the question is probably more than to what degree is our assessment similar or complementary to what others are doing.
No, thanks, Raymond, for the perspective. Hand in hand with early warning systems and provision, risk assessments have been set in place in many countries, and so definitely need for tools and methods is a growing area where support is needed. I understand from COP-related discussions there is work happening through the expert group on comprehensive risk management and others in terms of developing risk assessment guides. I'm going to pick up on the thread of non-economic loss and damage over here. And Philemone, if you would allow me to indulge you with this question. There's two questions over here, one which is from UEF Research and also from Makareta from Climate Talk in Fiji. Question is around how important is indigenous and traditional knowledge for adaptation, and whether there's been research that has been done to establish maybe putting a dollar value on non-economic losses. And in particular, Makareta is mentioning that in Fiji, non-economic loss is a major concern where many frontline communities are facing climate-forced displacement and relocation. And this ties very well with what you had been talking about in terms of relocation efforts in Fiji. So Philemone, please, over to you to provide some perspectives over here.
Oh, thanks, Alvin, and thank you for the question. Yes, putting a dollar value on such non-economic losses is something quite new to any country, and I think that is a challenge that we are now dealing with in how we can better address this. And for us in Fiji, we have an Itauke Affairs Ministry, and they are tasked with ensuring that that this can be documented. The traditional and cultural information and indigenous knowledge that will be lost due to certain relocations from communities and their ties and their stories. For us right now, it's just ensuring that it is documented. Putting a dollar value on it is quite hard. Some may say that it is even priceless, our indigenous knowledge. And what is important is that it is captured and that it is there for the generations that are to come in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Philemone. And in that regard, there's discussion online around more need to understand non-economic loss and damage, traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous knowledge systems and culture, particularly its importance around supporting adaptation, but also mechanisms to address loss and damage. Hafiz, there is a really good question over here. You did talk about Bangladesh's effort around averting, minimizing and addressing loss and damage. And many of these, of course, were talked in the context of extreme events. Perhaps maybe if you could just give us a bit of a spill, what mechanisms are in place to address loss and damage caused by slow onset processes? So slow onset being sea level rise, perhaps long-term droughts, etc. So Hafiz, perhaps you could just give us a spill on this one. Just want to check whether Hafiz is still there. We might have lost Hafiz. On that note, if any of the panelists...
Alvin, I got back. I was facing difficulties. Could you please kindly repeat it?
Okay, Bikram Rana has a question. What mechanisms are in place to address loss and damage caused by slow onset processes?
At the national level?
Yes, at the national level.
It's a very good question, but challenge is, the slow onset processes and its associated impacts and vulnerabilities, those are resulting the critical loss and damage, including residual loss and damage. So at this moment, not only in Bangladesh, I think not any countries at the national level they're addressing the slow onset events and non-economic loss and damage. That's why at the outset we need to identify the needs of the vulnerable communities and ecosystems. Based on the need assessment, we need to develop the right tools and methodologies to assess those sort of loss and damage. So those technical guidance must come from the Warsaw International Mechanism. Warsaw International Mechanism can develop in collaboration with its expert groups as standard common tools and methods. Further, those tools and methods needs to be localized with national level expertise and experiences. This is how the governance process needs to move. That's my understanding. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Hafiz. And perhaps, Raymond, you could weigh on this. And you talked about impact-based forecast mechanisms, and I wonder whether it covers slow onset events as well.
Yes.
Raymond, sorry.
Sorry, your question was if impact-based forecasting also covers slow onset, right? Indeed. Yes. Yes. So yeah, it does. For drought, for example, we do have impact-based forecasting in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. In Asia Pacific, it is mostly ZOOD, so in Mongolia, the harsh winter conditions, where we have a lead time of around 2 months, and depending, we're revising the trigger mechanisms, so maybe even more. So yes, that is also an option there. Yeah, I think what I maybe missed also to say before, I think impact-based forecasting, so understanding the impact of what is about to happen is as important as having, for example, the financing in place. So I think the discussion that is also interesting is how to connect the financing that is available for climate development and humanitarian actors, and then making sure that this is on the one hand connected, but also that there is more, or that there is new and adequate funding for loss and damage, because the humanitarian system is already stretched, right? And equally is funding for development programs. So really to have that, I guess, open discussion that funding for, addressing loss and damages is also taking into account new funding streams there.
No, thank you, Raymond, for that perspective. And colleagues, friends, participants, we are now in the final part of our webinar. We are slightly over time, and I will attempt to very quickly summarize the key points that actually came out of the webinar. We started with the broad aim of better understanding loss and damage needs in the Asia Pacific region. And we heard from Melanie around the science of loss and damage, where IPCC is quite clear that loss and damage is increasing with the increasing temperature. And important in this issue is, of course, averting and also limiting greenhouse gas emissions so that temperatures are well below 1.5 degrees. We definitely then afterward heard the policy dimension to loss and damage, and Anna talked about many of the initiatives that the Executive Committee and the Warsaw International Mechanism under the UNFCCC is leading, particularly around knowledge that are being produced on various thematic areas by expert group, Fiji Clearinghouse Mechanism, and also the future provision of technical assistance through the Santiago network. We then had very interesting perspectives from Bangladesh, from Fiji, and also from IFRC on what mechanisms are being used to address loss and damage. In the case of Bangladesh, with the increasing loss of lives, livelihoods, and displacement, Hafiz had mentioned, examples of Environment Acts, national adaptation plans, and possibly nationally determined contributions that are incorporating different aspects of loss and damage. Innovation is also happening in terms of doing comprehensive needs assessments of loss and damage. In the case of Fiji, we heard that climate relocation guidelines had been developed. It is also a dire situation where 40 communities in Fiji are actually waiting to be relocated, and 6 communities have been relocated. In addition to that, we heard of the Environment and Climate Levy system that has been developed nationally to support these relocation efforts. In the case of IFRC, it was interesting hearing how IFRC and partners are supporting early warning systems and climate services in different countries in the region, including provision of impact-based forecast and local vulnerability assessments to support an understanding of local level needs. It was also interesting hearing of a forward vision from Practical Action, where Colin provided us the civil society perspectives. And one of the key things that I took from him was the access modalities under the Santiago network to access finance and technical assistance needs to be flexible and needs to go hand in hand with any provision of finance needs to go hand in hand with the technical assistance. Thank you, colleagues, participants, and panelists. This was a very enriching discussion. We will try and summarize the key points that came from this webinar, from this regional conversation, and share with the participants. At the same time, the questions are still flowing. We will collect this question and pass this to the right, to the number of panelists that you heard of. And we will make an attempt to get back to you on your questions. This is no doubt a very enriching, a very ongoing and live conversation. And the UN Environment Programme, the Asia Pacific Adaptation Network, as well as the Global Adaptation Network is, we are very pleased to be part of this conversation in the region. Helen, I will now pass this over to you for any closing remarks. Thank you, colleagues. Vinaka Vakelevu.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Alvin. Thank you, everyone. And yes, I will be very, very brief because we are already way past our time, and I apologize for that. It was just too interesting and a very rich conversation. So yes, on behalf of APAN, I would just like to thank all speakers, our wonderful moderator, and all participants for bearing with us with the timing. And we will definitely share the slides and upload the recording, so you will be able to also, of course, view this afterwards. Thank you very much again, and I hope you will also join our next webinar in September, which will touch upon biodiversity and climate change. Thank you very much.
Perhaps before we can go, if we can open up our videos and take a very quick snapshot. All our panelists, speakers, participants, I welcome you to join that. Helen, let us know when you are ready for that.
Vanessa.
Can I request everyone to probably just for us, 30 seconds, open your videos.
I am trying to. Okay. Okay, thank you. Smile a little bit, everyone. Thank you again. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, and we will now end this webinar session over here. It was a pleasure joining you all. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you again. Sorry about the time.
Thank you. Bye.